Thank you all so much for coming. As you can see, Arjun is such a major draw for all of us. I'm delighted to welcome Arjun Appadurai, who is the Goddard Professor in Media, Culture and Communication at New York University. Arjun is no stranger to most of you in this room. His work on globalization, cultural flows, and language as social practice has been influential across many fields, extending well beyond South Asian studies. The many projects that he both participated in and inspired around the world have brought crucial attention to the interconnections between the local and the global, the micro-practices of multiple cultures, and their consumption and circulation in the global economy and in global media. Arjun's interest has always been in the big picture, even as he attends in minute detail to particular and localized communities and the institutions they make or alternatively resist. Beginning with his first book, Worship and Conflict Under Colonial Rule, which is an astoundingly rich ethnography and social history of temple worship in South India. And I was just telling you the other day, what an important book it's been, I think, for me and for many people. Anyone who knows Arjun's work never fails to be astonished by the range of his critical scholarship, among the most recent being his study of language and the global financial system, in the book Banking on Words, in which he traces the 2008 economic collapse to the languages of risk-taking, and in effect argues that derivative finance is vulnerable to language and imagination as much as any other social practices. His work on cities and globalization, with particular emphasis on Mumbai, has extended to a study of the popular uprisings in India in recent weeks, spurred by protests against the CAA and NRC. The talk that he will give today addresses the recent upheaval, and it is titled The Campaign to Kill a Mass Democracy, the Long and Short of India's Durée. So please join me in welcoming Arjun to the South Asian Institute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Gauri. Thanks to all of you. I'm really very honored. Excited to be here and to be at the South Asian Institute, where I don't think I've spoken for a long time. In fact, I don't think I've spoken at Columbia for a long time, but since we're here, I'm thinking back to when. It's quite a long time ago, I think. But as many of you here know, I have many friends here, colleagues here in all sorts of nooks and crannies of this great university, and also many generations. So it's wonderful to be able to share these thoughts, and I want to thank Gauri for making me so welcome, introducing me so graciously, and also Akil, who originally knew that I was going to be here this time and raised this possibility with Gauri, who kindly picked it up because I'm here for a short time. Since I don't live now in New York, I live in Berlin. And I mention that because that may be part of the optic of a different kind of distance from India, which may be reflected in what I say, but also considerable attention to what's happened there. So thanks very much. The other thing I should say is a word about what I'm about to share. So, like almost all of you here, I'm keenly conscious that the situation in India is changing rapidly, and of course very worrisome, in a very worrisome way, and that we are witnessing new assaults on Indian democracy every day. For this very reason, it might be helpful to look back at what has happened in the short period since the abrogation of Article 370 in regard to Kashmir, and to place this short period in the context of various longer durées in the history of this region. And I also should say this essay is a slightly remixed version of several pieces that some of you may have seen, and if so, you feel free to take a nap while I'm in them, but kind of mixed up to keep you awake, that I've been publishing in The Wire, which is an outlet many of you know, over the last 6 months or so, in a kind of frenzy of concern to share my thoughts, and I'm very grateful to The Wire and to its founders, both Siddharths, but particularly Siddharth Bhatia, who has made it possible for me to put these things out, and very fast, and with wonderful editorial help. So that's a context of this material. So I launch into it now. We are witnessing India's first mass movement since the movement for national independence, which began in the 1880s and ended in 1947. At no time since 1947, at least in my view, have we seen such an inspiring show of democratic dissent, bringing together students and workers, old and young, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and other faiths, Marxists, liberals, and traditional nationalists, government servants, and corporate leaders, men and women. In this mass movement, women, students, and youth in general are the leaders, with Muslims speaking especially their minds with a courage born out of the sense that other options are non-existent. The emergency, as some have pointed out, had some of these features, but the broad opposition to Indira Gandhi recognized that they, in other words, the opposition, recognized that she had some ability to listen, learn, and respond by comparison to the current regime. And at a time when many of us are on the barricades, either literally, physically, materially, or politically and in our minds, it is easy to be caught up in the news of the day, the week, or the month. At such times, we need to bear India's long history in mind and put our apocalyptic moment in some long-term perspective. And in this light, I have a few observations to offer, which I'll move in and out of. The first has to do with the long history of the relationship. I have to say, by the way, that I'm assuming, and I think I'm justified here, that the basic facts are largely known to all of you, so I'm not going to do this happened when Modi is the Prime Minister and so on, because there's not time to do that and also give you my analysis. But I'm happy in our Q&A to clarify anything more factual that is not clear. So the first has to do with the long history of the relationship between Gujarat, the state which nurtured the careers of Modi and Shah over decades, and also saw the Goddard train burning of 2002, a relationship that is between them and Goddard, a relationship which helped them to leverage a national platform for their vision of a polity cleansed of Muslims in particular, other things too, but that particular. But these events in Gujarat have a deeper history which goes back to 1956, when the Gujarati speakers of Bombay began to lose the city to Marathi-speaking regionalists, and the states of Maharashtra and Gujarat were born. From the Bombay Gujarati point of view, Bombay was a city built by Gujarati and Parsi capital, but also the long-term home of many Marathi speakers, whom the Gujarati mercantile elite feared and disliked because, whom the Gujarati mercantile elite stigmatized as largely lowly domestic workers and factory serfs. And so Marathi speakers for whom these were the views, and Muslims whom they had already feared and disliked because of the long Gujarati and RSS historiography of the Muslim ravaging of the Hindu temples of that region, among other things. Thus, the loss of Bombay in and around 1956 was a double loss for many Gujaratis, which was only redeemed in part by the ascendance and virtually royal status of people like the Ambanis today. The southern end of Gujarat meets the northern end of Maharashtra on the Arabian Sea in a belt that runs from Mandwa to Daman and Diu, always a zone of struggle between Gulf pirates, coastal Marathi-speaking magnates and state functionaries, and Gujarati-speaking merchants and smugglers. Some of you may remember the last name Amtule, very interesting character who comes out of this belt, the chief minister, notoriously corrupt, now forgotten because all the stuff is on steroids, so he seems like a mild chap from our kind of perspective. Though many in Gujarat do not identify strongly with Bombay, that is in the state of Gujarat, and its loss in 56, for ideologues and strategists like Shah and Modi, the mutual traffic between them, the Adanis, the Ambanis, and other smaller Bombay tycoons is the key counterweight to the power of Maratha regionalism, which has become, of course, recently openly anti-BJP and anti-Gujarati again. In the weeks since Uddhav Thackeray became the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, and this is of course a story in itself, but I just mentioned here. In short, the Modi-Shah regime is built on its whipping up of regional angers and hatreds in Gujarat from 2002 to 2014. And this Gujarati power base for Modi is a key part of the current BJP effort to impose a reign of terror in much of the rest of India. Gandhian nonviolence is not simply a product of the deep strain of Jain Ahimsa-related traditions in Gujarat. In fact, Gandhi flew in the face of the massive propensity of Gujarati populations in Surat, Baroda, Ahmedabad, and other cities in Gujarat to turn to violence against Muslims since at least the late 18th century, and that history could be longer. The Modi-Shah combine has leveraged this long-term Gujarati history into a national program for ethnic cleansing. I switch frame a little bit now. The abrogation of Article 370 of the Constitution, the dismemberment of the state in Kashmir have been, of course, much commented upon in recent months. In fact, slightly overshadowed by recent developments, as many people also point out. Some commentators have seen these frightening events, that is the Kashmir events, as rehearsals of what was to come elsewhere in India, and others as extensions of state repression in Kashmir and elsewhere in India by all the ruling parties since 1947. And today, though, of course, Kashmir is not as high in the headlines due to other claims on the headlines, the fate of ordinary Kashmiris looks dire, and India's claim to be a democracy is facing its most severe test there, even though it's not in our faces all the time. The causes of the recent decision by this regime to accomplish a legal coup in Kashmir surely have long-term causes and motives. But the short-term trigger, I think, was the need to give their electorate something to salve the Indian diplomatic defeat, in the aftermath of the so-called surgical strikes in Balakot in February 2019. So the abrogation of Article 370 for Kashmir in August 2019 is, in a way, a blood offering for the BJP military mouse that roared in February 2019. Thus, Kashmir is indeed a proxy for Pakistan, but in a new context. The stunning abrogation of state privileges for Kashmir that happened in August and subsequent to that may have been prepared months, perhaps years ago, but it became a necessity for the BJP in the course of this past year. And we can say more about, discuss more about the sequence and the force of the necessity of that sequence, and of course the play of contingency. Lots there not clear. But there's another long-term proxy logic at play for the BJP in Kashmir since August of 2019, and this does indeed have again to do with Gujarat after the pogroms against the Muslim population of Gujarat in 2002 and well after. So in the months after the Goddard train burning, a democratically elected government in Gujarat, as all of you know, led by Chief Minister Modi, then Chief Minister Modi, ably abetted by the present Home Minister, oversaw a systematic effort to target Muslims, to sponsor mob violence against them, to mobilize detailed data, to target Muslim leaders, homes and businesses, and to cordon off the Muslim population of Gujarat in the name of peace and security. This series of actions by the Modi regime in Gujarat was largely accomplished by organized mobs, but was closely supported by the bureaucracy and the armed forces at the disposal of the Chief Minister and of Amit Shah and others. This time in Kashmir, and of course we can also think about the other locations in India since then, but Kashmir is especially important. This time in Kashmir, the Indian Army and its various paramilitary arms did not need mobs to inflict terror in and on Kashmir. They are the organized mob that holds Kashmiris hostage in their own land and homes. A very big shift. Gujarat was Modi's political lab for his push to national power and his incomplete effort to terrorize Muslims in Gujarat after the Goddard incident. And this period, in my view, witnessed the first major state experiment in mobilizing legal, bureaucratic, and military power in the service of reducing Indian Muslims to bare humans. That is Gujarat, post-Goddard. So during this period, therefore, the recent period, the last 6 months, coming close to now again, Kashmir could be seen to have played or be playing a dual role for the BJP. It confirmed the power of a Hinduized state machinery to terrorize Muslims, as in Gujarat in 2002, and it restored the reputation of this regime in the eyes of its followers by making Kashmir perform the role of a fully dominated territory of India, the displaced fantasy of Indian rule over Pakistan, which of course also is a huge masculinist thing with Kashmir feminized. There's a lot more to be said about it. We can come to that later perhaps. Thus has Kashmir, in a phrase I use, become Kashmiristan, where India can now exercise its full dominion without losing the appearance of being a parliamentary democracy, at least among many opinion makers in the world. That number has changed, but still rather fractionally. Sitting in Europe, I can tell you, it's another discussion, but it is amazing what Modi and Indian government standing still is, in spite of the Times, the Economist, the this, the that, all of whom 6 months ago were completely somewhere else, as many people have pointed out. Another question regarding the attack on democracy by the BJP RSS machine in the last 6 months, because this is really my present, is the 6 months from August or so, raises is about what the long-term ends of this ruling regime are and how it has gotten this far in the effort to dismantle the infrastructure of democracy in India. And here I offer a detour, or one more detour, into the even longer durée of the subcontinent and the nature of caste, class, and power in this region over 2 millennia. No serious anthropologist or historian of India can claim to have decisively answered the following basic question: why has caste as an ideology, a social formation, and a cosmology spread and survived over 2 millennia or more without any sort of central political authority, bureaucracy, or continental religious organization of priests, monks, or clerical staff? The spread and persistence of this unique form of racial, ethnic, and economic stratification has been studied to the ground, one might say, in all its avatars, variations, and disguises, but its remarkable region-wide and historical tenacity has not yet, in my view, been accounted for adequately. The puzzling fact is that caste, in my view, which is the beginnings of an answer to what this may be about, but though that's not my central concern today here, is that caste, in my view, functions in a cellular, metastatic, and decentralized manner in which some sort of social and political DNA replicates itself successfully by grafting itself onto a remarkable range of ecological, social, and historical contexts, extending from today's Pakistan to today's Bangladesh, and from Nepal to Sri Lanka. So that raises a whole bunch of questions which I'm not going to tackle directly, but that is my view, and I should tell you that the main person from whom I got an initial thought in that direction is a person not read that much anymore, whose name is Barrington Moore, great historian of democracy, dictatorship, revolution, who in many ways had a very generalized grasp of India. He was not a specialist, but he had the insight that it was somehow cellular, the whole formation there was cellular, and therefore its resistance to revolution had a very particular quality. So I owe him that insight, and I've been toying with it for decades and trying to think about how do we connect it to what we actually know of the workings. And it's not an easy affair, but at least it's a direction. So whatever the answer to this massive puzzle, which is also a professional puzzle for me as an anthropologist and many other anthropologists, except those who think that it's somehow answered, that's not my group, it's not my jati. It casts an unexpected light on the BJP RSS organizational structure and might let us see the current regime. And here I know I'm on, I won't call it thin ice, but maybe a long branch or something like that. Not so much as a smooth machinery of media-savvy, populist militarization and xenophobic mobilization, but, to overstate it slightly, but to clarify, as a blundering, uncoordinated, poorly run series of initiatives, policies, and programs. The actual rollout of every major BJP policy since 2014 has been a chaotic instance of shoot now, check targets later. And the latest budget and so on makes this 10 times as clear as everything else before. The state of the economy, everything now casts greater light on that. Some of this blundering ad hoc quality is visible, of course, in demonetization, in the hot and cold moves in relation to Pakistan, in the ridiculously ambitious housing and sanitation policies of the state, no more defecation, and in a kind of brilliant Stalinist way, many things are declared to be so. We have done X, we have done Y. You look around to it, what do you mean you've done X, done Y? Well, Stalin did that with respect to industrialization. He said, we are industrialized society. Oh, well then let me kill a few million kulaks and we'll make it match my view of what the facts are. In the hot and cold, or in these ridiculous housing and sanitation policies. I don't know how many of you have had the delight of looking at some of the boring but very important material on goals for rural housing, urban housing, beyond insane for what can be accomplished by anybody, anywhere. But just simply declared as doable, and then of course people forget all that. Who's reading what the housing goals were for Uttar Pradesh for the next 5 years. So, and also in the chaotic enforcement of the new population policies in Assam and beyond now. So this kind of blundering ad hoc quality has been visible in almost every major domain. In truth, in my view, the only place where the Modi-Shah machine has shown anything like a centralized organization is in the election business. That's a place where you can say there's a machine, they collect the money, they do this. But if you go outside of the elections, it's a very different matter. The biggest series, of course, of clownish maneuvers was in Maharashtra, as you all know, recently, where Modi and Shah were brilliantly outmaneuvered by Sharad Pawar, Uddhav Thackeray, and others who nurse grudges against the BJP. So much for brilliant central organization. Key state handled stupidly, assuming for a moment no judgment about it, just look at them as operators, very, very. Now, I also want to say as a side note, which we can return to later, this view that the current regime is not powerfully organized centrally, one of the major pieces of evidence about that is the RSS, how it operates. But if you look at everybody on the front lines, wanting to kill Muslims, rape people, do this, do that, it's not the RSS. The RSS is marching around somewhere in their chaddis, I don't see the RSS in the front in Shaheen Bagh. I don't see the RSS anywhere. They may be behind something, but all I'm saying is it doesn't make sense to me to invoke the RSS steadily as the kind of front line. It is not the front line. The front line is all kinds of other people. An infinite variety of semi-identified, semi-identifiable, semi-coherent. Say RSS, I'm actually wondering, where is the RSS? If this is a project of Hindu Rashtra, which is actively underway and requires everybody on board, they must be hiding themselves in some brilliant way, because I don't see that connection so clearly. So, but that's a side point, also arguable. In short, in my view, the BJP RSS power machine works somewhat in the same way, I don't say identical, somewhat in the same way as caste has worked for millennia, not because there is a brilliant central machine in which the parts and whole are tightly meshed, but because there is something in the BJP formula of xenophobia, anti-minority rage, anti-secularism, and promises of a quick fix, which helped it succeed from place to place and has given it the longest run it has enjoyed in Delhi. I mean, it's not a millennium, it's not a century, it's a short period, but I think that's where we need to look. So this, in my view, to again take the Barrington Moore kind of idea of cellularity, is, in my view, cellular or metastatic fascism, and not vertebrate or coordinated fascism. So this, among other things, for me, is the difference with, say, Nazi Germany, where it's very hard to say that just kind of cellular thing happening somewhere. Everything was organized, planned, predicted, from Wannsee to the war to the armaments and munitions, every single thing. Successful, not successful, another matter, but you cannot say it kind of happened like that. I think in India you still can. And so in addition to this structural dynamic, let's say where you proliferate, not because of a central structure, but because of some other dynamic hard to name, we also need to recall, and this too is a matter of the longue durée and from a slightly different lens, or let's say call it a cultural lens, rather than an organizational, structural lens, which is the caste issue. We also need to recall how Hindu India has traditionally regarded powerful persons, kings of all sorts. Excuse me. Modi evidently has a massive charisma surplus, both in relation to others in the BJP RSS world and in relation to the whole array of opposition leaders, most of whom would make the claim that they are colorless, a hyperbole. He's a Hindu samrat, full-blown, often wearing the turbaned headgear of royalty, who also picks up on the iconography of the militant sadhu and the celibate ascetic. So these are things that have mixed up before, but the blend is again new, but the ingredients can be seen in 100 ways at 100 periods. These images, of course, have long cohabited in the Hindu imaginary, and they operate or operated in an economy of gifts, ritual deference, and tribute, which has nothing to do with civility, law, or due process. In this cosmology, the king upholds the dharmic order and does whatever is needed to accomplish this, including the expansion of territory, the extraction of tribute, the personal settlement of disputes, the distribution of titles, honors, and fiefdoms, and the triumphalist elimination of enemies. This is the Hindu Rashtra, and what Modi and Shah have done is to capture enough of the resources of a modern nation state to perform the drama of a Hindu theater state, Cliff Geertz's great phrase, with enough force and fakery to capture a major part of the electorate for the last 6 years. Modi in particular has gained tremendous mileage by annexing the means and procedures of an electoral democracy, and I'll come back to this point, annexing the means and procedures of an electoral democracy to the messages, icons, and rituals of an ersatz Hindu kingdom. I'll come back to this business of democracy, and it will be very crucial. India, however, is not, I think, just following a global swing to the authoritarian right. And many of you know there's a considerable literature now on that phenomenon of the Erdogans, the Trumps, this one. No one can avoid seeing that there's something going on. I've written something on that which I just will allude to because it's the back of my mind for what I'm sharing today. And that's a paper with the title Democracy Fatigue, which is an effort to ask, for all the differences, what might we say is going on in this worldwide process, which is not obviously based on consultation, coordination, but cannot be said to be a simple coincidental conjuncture of 10 societies. And my thought there is that what is shared among many of these places, perhaps not everyone, is and I draw here on Albert Hirschman's great work on loyalty, voice, an exit to say what is being done is an expression of fatigue with democracy. That is the slowness, the deliberation, the waiting, and so on. And so what is being done is elections become a means, a democratic means to elect somebody who actually hates democracy. So that is our situation. Therefore, we have to be careful of analogies for older times, but this is a new thing. And I'll say a word about it, a little more about it. So the innovation which is now being tried out in India is the successful closing, and if you say, what is the content of this exit from democracy, and the people who are elected in due to that fatigue, and who seem to thrive in that context, Trump, Modi, Erdogan, many others. The innovation is the successful closing of the gap between what, again, in the Wire and some essay I've called the gap between procedural fascism and substantive fascism. Procedural fascism is exemplified by the abrogation of Article 370, the NRC-CA process in Assam and beyond, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, and the recent Supreme Court ruling on Ayodhya, about which I have not said much, but we can talk about it. It's all part of it. In each case, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature have made fascism far more respectable than it ever was in India at the highest formal levels. That's why I call it procedural fascism. At the same time, the spate of rapes, murders, burnings, lynchings, and other humiliations of women, Dalit, Muslims, and children throughout India have raised substantive fascism to an unimaginable public level. The connection between those two is a very important thing, because anybody who follows the news in India can see there are two things going on. One is the Supreme Court, legislature, law, NRC, and the other is brutality of every time at the very bottom. So anybody who's vaguely, concerned with social processes has to ask, are they two things and they just happen to go together? What? So I'm struggling with that myself. A part of the longer history of today's procedural fascism, again I go to a slightly longer view, has its root in what many of us have studied and been trained in, partly by our guru Barney and so on, Barney Cohn, the great Barney Cohn, has its root in the colonial ideologies of enumeration, classification, and control. These ideologies were part of the inclusive imperialism of the British. By the way, one of the things that recently has struck me, that British imperialism, in the end of the day, wants everybody in. This imperialism wants to send everybody out, except 3 people. At the end, there will only be 3 people left standing. So that's a big difference. You can say this is also imperial and this and that. Well, very different objectives and logics. I'll repeat that sentence, but I wandered off. These ideologies, as the ones tied up with counting, enumeration, classification, were part of the inclusive imperialism of the British and the developmental ambitions of the Nehruvian order, in which the state was the developmental tool of the nation, or nationalism, you might say. But today, with the post-democratic turn to fascism worldwide, so this is India and many other places, a new order is emerging which seems, and now I make a slight shift again to say, how do we grasp all this, flag the end of the era of the citizen. India is at the forefront of this development. So the idea of citizenship was linked in its Latin derivation, as you all know, to the city, civitas, civility, civilis, and to other related words which implied urbanity, civic norms, and hospitality in the age of liberal democracy, born from the constitutions of France and the US in the late 18th century. Citizenship as an idea anchored the rights of citizens to participate freely, fully, and equally in political life. The developments of the subsequent centuries saw the birth of the idea of representation, of elections, and of political parties, all seen as further ways of organizing, expressing, representing the rights of citizens in large countries. The problem was that in this view, the city was the boundary of citizenship. And in modern times, this boundary morphed into the boundary of the modern nation state. And that, of course, thereby hangs a tale that thousands of deep thinkers have contributed to. Among them, as Foucault showed, the era of the nation state was also the era of censuses, territorial sovereignty, panoptical incarceration, and a general rise in governmentality, by which he meant the penetration of state power into every aspect of human life. Still, the original idea of citizenship retained a kind of spectral life in this period from the 18th century to now, as it became the legal basis of national identity, as formalized in the universality of passports, for example. In the course of the last 3 decades, I think we have witnessed the rise of extreme nationalism, and national citizenship, in some very strange way, has become insufficient as a credible basis for belonging in the political community. That's why I say citizenship is ending. Citizenship was no longer sufficient. I coined a little term to catch something new which I don't fully understand, so it's a placeholder, not the most elegant term. So I say the nation state needs now what I call statisms, not citizens, statisms. What is a statism? Here again, as in some other of these dark matters, India is, I think, a pioneer, notably with the NRC mechanism in Assam, and of course the affiliated things which are being already tried out, the detention centers, all that other stuff, which have become examples for other states in India. The violence of the NRC policy, as all of you know, has many dimensions, which include anti-Muslim violence, anti-migrant policies, extraordinary cruelty towards marginal populations, impossible demands for proof of citizenship, and efforts to consolidate Hindutva control of all regions which adjoin other Muslim nations. The dimension which concerns me here when I say citizenship is fast disappearing and we have something else, I call it statism, you can call it something else, which is coming. What concerns me is the new centrality. I say the new centrality of bureaucratic documentation as the sole and overriding criterion of citizenship. The statizan is one who belongs because he or she has been granted a state-certified document. Notice we've come very far from the British census here. British census didn't give a damn who's Tom and who's John, you know. It was all Dogras, all Browns, whatever. And then some little refinements here and there. And for named individuals, there were other interests British had. Who's the guy who's actually led that revolution? We find out where he lives. But it's not the world of Aadhaar, which I'm coming to in a minute. So, possible demands for proof of citizenship and efforts to consolidate Hindutva control of all regions which adjoin other Muslim nations. So, bureaucratic documentation, the statizan is one who belongs because he or she has been granted a state-certified document. All his or her rights flow from that fact alone. That fact alone. There is a complex history here. Of course, we could go back to the census, as I say, and its workings in colonial India, as well as to various forms of registration for property, security, or social benefits, both during colonial rule and after independence in 1947. But throughout the century and a half of this prior history, state documentation of any kind was seen as proof of an identity which had other roots, whether territorial, familial, religious, or natural. This extra state source of citizenship has been withering for some time in India. The decisive moment of its demise, in my view, was the successful installation of the Aadhaar project and of the card. That was the moment. Many activists, rightly at the time, protested the Aadhaar card on the grounds that it would become a basis for controlling dissent and identifying political enemies rather than serving as a tool for social entitlements. They were not wrong. But the real innovation of Aadhaar was not its biometric infrastructure, but its success in defining a state-issued document as the basis of all of life. Voting, rations, loans, taxation, and more. Aadhaar, in my view, was the midwife of the birth of the statism in India. The NRC policy, coming back to this regime, now is simply a weaponization of the logic behind Aadhaar and will surely spread to other states, meaning beyond India. The new forms of documentation mark a troubling new moment in the rise of statism over nationalism. And I'm going to make another little small provocation as I wind my talk up. Statism over nationalism. When the nation state was born as a political form, the state was seen as the guarantor and bureaucratic tool for ensuring the proper allocation of rights, protections, and freedoms to national citizens, but nationality was a justification for state power. Now, a little more than 2 centuries after the birth of the nation state, generally as a form of formation, the state and its powers have become the primary source of value, normativity, and legitimacy. And the nation is a flexible concept which is a secondary attribute of citizens. Thus, extreme nationalism, including Hindutva, is simply the alibi and Trojan horse for something, in my view, far more dangerous, which is extreme statism. And extreme statism requires a population of statisms, that is, inhabitants whose very right to life, as well as to liberty, dignity, well-being, depends on their documented status as citizens, that is, as statisms. It is true that the first victims of this process are the poor, the marginal, the displaced, the occupied, and the minor. But we, erstwhile bourgeois citizens, are next in line. All of us will have to endure the price of being turned from citizens into statisms, and the price for some of us will be exclusion, expulsion, or extermination. This is not a minor or incremental change. It is a potentially major change in the logic of political sovereignty in India and elsewhere. It is a tectonic shift which explains what has puzzled many of us in trying to account for the global shift to right-wing populist authoritarian regimes. Nationalism, white, brown, or yellow, is no longer an end, but a means to the democratic installation of anti-democratic regimes. Right-wing rulers win elections, but their aim is not so much ethno-national purity, or primarily or eventually, as it is the absolute power of states to define affiliation, belonging, and legal existence. The electoral blocs which voted for Modi, Trump, Erdogan, recently Bolsonaro, and many other of this brand of authoritarian person, you could call dictator, elected dictator, lots of terms, may have been motivated to some extent by racism, anti-globalism, fear of economic displacement, or the like, but they were electoral fodder for a bigger project, in my view, which is the eclipse of the nation by the state. The sacralization of the state is not without precedent. The Soviet Union and Mao's China are major examples of state-defined nationalism in which ideas about the ethnic uniqueness of Han Chinese or ethnic Russians were not an end, but a means to the overarching power of the state. Going further back in time, many of the great empires of the world, such as the Roman, the Ottoman, the Mughal, and the British, were also not about ethnos, but about the sacrality of the ruling royal house. But today's citizens are the undesirables of failed democracies, of modern nation states that have opted to drop the idea of the people, the demos, or the citizenry in favor of the counted, documented, loyal, and certified supporters of the state. In India, in my view, they can be Hindu or Muslim, Dalit or Brahmin, Kashmiri or Adivasi, as long as they line up with the ruling regime. This is the sole requirement of a statism. Now, this is of course an extreme thing because there's a lot of violence directed against these other groups, but I do think in the end, if, for example, you had a public declaration by a large organization of Dalits, for example, that they are fully with the BJP, they will not be subjected to the same regime. Same holds for Muslims, same holds, and we've seen this in micro. Muslim people, Muslim politicians brought in the BJP, but that can be a mass process because the issue is, I think, in the end, not about that kind of minor. Some of us have long recognized the need for a fundamental change in the universal acceptance of the architecture of the nation state. I come back here to a very old concern of mine. Our hopes have been fulfilled, perhaps, but in a horrible way. The sacrality of the nation is about to be democratically eclipsed by the sacrality of the states. States will now define who belongs to them. They will war among each other for global resources. They will make cynical alliances. They will manipulate global capitalist possibilities for resources, for technologies, for markets, and for profits, all to advance themselves. And since authoritarian populism is the best way to assure compliant citizens, it is likely to be the hegemonic ideology of the coming decades. India is committed, I promise you that I'm almost done, I was through it, is the religion of the state, but it is not alone in this. Everywhere we see the transformation of the state into a new political form which claims monopoly of both political means and moral ends. Statizens will provide the democratic army of this new form. So the last question I want to ask is, what is the fuel of this? And here I'll just summarize because time is running out. To say that I think that the fuel is something in another of these essays which I call aspirational hatred. That is to say, there is an ideological mood or mode in which the impunity of the most iconic figures who are dominating politics. Take Ajay Singh Bisht, huge state, huge Muslim population, guy walks like a colossus, and he's now in Delhi, of course. It's totally remarkable, but the acquittal, every day there's a new one, of rapists who are running for office, were in office, sadhus, yogis of every type, but also others who are simply bureaucrats, Gogoi himself. I mean, the list is, the impunity is massive. If you ask what is this about, the impunity has also become a model for impunity at every level. So if you have a vast elite that conducts corruption, abuse of power, rape, and other forms of real and material and rhetorical abuse, which is increasing literally every day, well, then it's no surprise that people, more humble people who are not in a position to make the most subtle judgments about things, will also, as it were, aspire to that kind of ability to hate with impunity. And I think that is one angle on the apparent spread of attacks on women, Dalits, and so on, everywhere, especially in the heartland of the north, but really everywhere. We've seen the case in Hyderabad, Honorary. There's no limit. Tamil Nadu, I mean, it's just endless. So no exceptionalism is possible here. Even Kerala, you can see things going on, even though that state is generally positioned differently. Bengal too. So there's something going on there which also has to do with, clearly I think, and I just wind up with this, with gender. And the fact that there is a kind of now impunity or license in which all of these things can be enacted, first and above all with women, and not just the poorest and most vulnerable, but any and all. And that's somehow woven into the logic I'm talking about, where the models are models of impunity, and how impunity is absolutely a good part of what power is about. But if that's so it can be for us. Therefore, having said all this and suggested that this kind of impunity instituted at the top, which is something to do with procedural fascism and the other things I mentioned, then creates a broad iconography of what's possible, especially for males at all levels. Therefore, the question then is, where do we stand now? And my sense is, I am still not completely lacking in hope about the current moment, although things are moving every day, both with the highly visible signs of organized resistance like Shaheen Bagh and its counterparts in many, many parts of India, but also smaller movements, small town movements. I was in Maharashtra a few weeks ago, and there were movements in places like Malegaon here, which most people don't even know where they are on the map, but 50,000 people, 100,000 people. And the thought that finally gives me some cheer in the face of what looks like an inexorable process in which India is both part of something global and also leading in some ways, is I do the numbers and I say, here's a regime which again, Hindutva is, I still think, only an alibi for its self-worship, that is as a state order, is prepared to either marginalize or exterminate or extrude a population of which one component is 500 million people, Dalits plus Muslims. You know, which state apparatus is going to do this? So the question arises, what do they think? I don't have the answer to this, but I can certainly say if there is some central thought process on the BJP RSS side, they surely have given some thought to this. It's not a matter of taking, Ram Go on a bus ride or this or that, or horribly abusing, torturing others who have suffered vastly worse fate. But you have to deal with numbers, 500 mil. Forget the others, forget the artists, the journalists, the this one, the that one, the students. Just take these two populations out of 1.3. And that's going to happen in India. So there's a part of me that thinks it's just not doable. So, but what, can one take much hope from that? It's of course not an answer about resistance or its forms. It leaves many things open. But therefore, I think there's something truly insanely dystopic, Borgesian in its scope and scale, which is beyond any feasibility. And that I'm hoping that is the big Achilles heel which will allow us to organize around. So I'd stop on that note and thank you all for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Arjun. So you're willing to take some questions?
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful and very thought-provoking talk. I just had a question about this last point you made about impunity.
Yes.
So I was interested in the aspirational aspect you said, which seems to be working across populations. So there is a model of aspirational hatred. So the aspiration of everyone would be to achieve that status where you can have impunity with hatred. But I was intrigued about how you would then, two things, how you would account for, say, the Hyderabad encounter killing, and the whole, the catharsis that the public seemed to feel that justice had been done quickly. And also the idea of then these resistances, because it seems to me that the impunity model is probably not as homogeneous because then where is this sense of insecurity coming from that would give rise to these resistances, right? So in a sense, and also the encounter killing and how the sense of justice.
Or the debate over the sentence for the Nirbhaya rapists.
Exactly.
That there are many voices there.
It seems to me that it's a sense like it's like a conservation model. So these people have immunity, and therefore the Dalit rapists have to be hanged quicker because the Brahmin and Brahmin rapists can, so that they can go on bail. So it seems like there is like the impunity model is not as homogeneous then.
Yeah.
So I wondering if you have thoughts.
I'm very thank you. This is all very much thought in progress or work in progress. I think the impunity idea only can address some of this, because we are in the domain which is honestly very poorly developed so far as I know in the social and humanistic sciences, which is the domain of affect, so-called affect theory and all that. I think it actually has not done a lot with these materials. They are full of indeterminacy. They are full of complex socializing of psychologies or producing of intellectual individualities through mass psychology. Things that were theorized once upon a time, Frankfurt School, this one, that one. But I think a lot has been lost. And in the new forms of affect theory, I don't see much that I can use to engage exactly this. What is the set, or the set, one might say, of political affects, which is differentially mobilized, for whom, by whom, when, where. And I have no doubt you're right that I wouldn't say it's a matter of homogeneous, because I think it's more a matter of which set where. So impunity may be here, but something else may be there. And I don't have a good idea what all those something else would be. There's another issue, which is when you look at all these policemen particularly in Delhi and UP, who are in our faces all the time, but also to some extent Karnataka, here, there. What's going on here? It's also impunity, but it's impunity this way, you see. So is it that they're, the DSPs are like this and therefore they're learning something, or is it something else where actually much less controlled mass phenomena, motorcycle people, rapists, this, that, who are out, and many of them being unemployed youth. In UP, it's clear. Unemployment is a very big part of this. But where do the police come in, especially, are they the least of something very big, or are they the officialization of something very widespread? So they actually have the exact same set of affective possibilities as their counterparts who are not in the police. Is it that way? I don't know. I think this is both unknown to me and hard to do, but it is about what you're raising, that this is a complicated space.
Yeah, Akil?
No, sure. Let the students go first.
Thanks. Thank you for this fantastic talk. I was thinking about the Northeast when you were, giving your talk, partly because this is the first time we're seeing the Northeast playing such a big role in mainland Indian politics.
Yes.
And since we were talking about the way in which the imperial state approached it, it was constantly the excluded, and then with the post-colonial Indian state, you have this sort of mixture of brutality versus minimal governance. But
Correct.
Constantly it is the site of exception when it comes to citizenship.
Yeah.
Because you have all these sites of, excluded territories, sixth schedule, etc. And now, for the first time, we see the Indian state taking an exceptional interest in the Northeast. A state which has always been disinterested in these exceptional citizens are now sort of entering that area and saying, we are going to include you into a sort of procedural manner of citizenry, what you're calling citizenry. So in that sense, I felt like the Northeast gave us an excellent site to start off understanding, at least what you are drawing out in this talk.
Thank you again. Very, very important question for really seeing working out some of these things. How about here? How about very important, I believe. What I've been trying to learn about in reflecting on all these things is two places about which I knew shockingly little, Kashmir and the Northeast. But what has become clear to me, even as a late student of the finer points of, let's say, the history of Kashmir, or who were the Dogras, what was the Karan Singh's family, blah, blah, of which I knew generally, but not enough. Northeast even more so, having read long ago people like Sanjay Hazarika and so on, but never been able to know the full story. It's too dispersed in scholarly terms. But I still think I get the impression that Kashmir and Assam are two very different kinds of labs. And whether the current regime knows that, or whether they don't know that, so there's a kind of, we'll count there, we'll have the soldiers there, we'll do, because the Indian army, for example, has been really much the same in both places. Now what you have, the added factor is on the Northeast side, this counting machine, which it's easy to say, why not just leave it alone? Why bite off this extraordinarily complicated problem on the ground? So it's always an interesting thing about states like this. They take on something thinking, it will be done. Say, people keep saying Amit Shah wants to show that he's not just a talker, he do this, do that. Well, in this regard, I think Kashmir and Assam, particularly, but the Northeast generally, are different because they do have a very long history, as many scholars have pointed out, negotiating, going to the, back to the Nagas, Fizo, so on. So they've been in this game in a very complicated way, somewhat more than Kashmir. So I'm with you completely that the Northeast is very important to understand, but I think there's some puzzle there about why it has been taken on in this way. You could have tried to do this somewhere else first. For example, if you want a big thing to bite, how about UP? You already have Ajay Singh there, Why go to the Northeast where there are hundreds of things you neither control nor understand? Anyway, that's just, I share my question with you. I don't know answer.
We have quite a few, Akil and I think Tejashwini.
Maybe we should get several on board.
Yeah, maybe we can, exactly, that would be a very excellent idea. Maybe we can take maybe 3 questions and then ask Arjun to respond as
best I can. Sure.
Yeah.
So, Arjun, on this terrifically interesting descriptive analysis, where you reconfigured, trying to describe the changes, very recent changes, the relationship in this hyphenated conjunction of nation-state, which has had a long run ever since Westphalia, and your claim, if I understand it, is that the emphasis has, in a sense, moved to the second half of the conjunct, and it's being done in this very bureaucratic form, documentation requirements and so on. I'm just wondering about, going back to the question of affect and so on, how it relates to this change. You see, because since Westphalia, a great deal of the consolidation of this hyphenated conjunction came by creating in the populace, within the territory, a feeling for the left-hand side of the conjunction. Right?
Yes.
Thereby legitimating the power exercised by the right, because they were fused in this way. Right? So it was very much an affect-based way of justifying state power, whatever, legitimating. When the shift happens, of the kind you're describing, I'm just curious where we can start tracking the nature of the shift in affect. So, just something to explore, because if you remember in the famous thing in The Prince, and Machiavelli says, should the prince ask arrange it so that the people love him or fear him, and he proposes fear because it would disallow the autonomy that love requires. You have to hand love over freely, but fear you just can't help giving. I'm just wondering, is it the case that, just as you say, state legitimation takes a different form, the affect now becomes much more overtly Machiavellian? Or is it that they work together? I mean, I'm just curious to explore these points about affect.
Thank you. Yeah, I hear you. Okay. So
would you like to take another
mine
couple
is
of questions?
connected. Mine is actually connected to Akhil's question, which is, I was just wondering, it's really quite fascinating, it's very provocative, your talk, and I was thinking about, to what is the, when you're saying like, democracy, right, is being eclipsed by the nation is being, the sacralization of the nation is being eclipsed by the sacralization of the state, and I was just trying to think, like, what is the end, what is the end kind of goal? Because at one level you're talking about the cellular nature of this, right, so that there isn't kind of a centralization behind this. So I'm wondering, one part of this, especially the documentation, I'm thinking like, can we think it back to these kind of discourses around modernity, right? Like the fact of modernity and the modern, where it's like, now finally, you have papers, you can be counted, being counted and being classified. Like, to me, I wonder, it's part of that same thing, the trains ran on time. Right?
Yeah.
So that idea of kind of efficiency, rationality, and which kind of connects up to like perhaps what is the kind of affective charge behind this notion of being a statism. Like, why is that so important to like be counted and documented? To whom? So that was my question. To what end is this statism like actually pointing towards?
Would you like to?
Well, maybe since they're also connected questions, both entirely to the point, I'll go to Tejas first, just to say, when I was recently in India, not very long, but with thinking about this stuff for months, one of the big debates among really very smart, informed, thoughtful, critical people was, what is the end game here? Are these guys nuts? Or they have a secret plan where, you can ruin the economy, lose everything, and still there's something you maximize? I mean, there's some kind of insane calculus here. Or are they indeed very calculating about everything they can give up in order to keep something else? If so, what's something else? So there is a hot debate going on. I certainly say I can't say much about it, although I do think the Modi-Shah thing, which is also the subject of a lot of controversy. Lots of people think Shah, somebody who I won't name, but a very smart person said, Shah will assassinate Modi at some point. At some point of their age, Modi will go because his use is going down. So that tells, and it was not a lunatic person saying it. It was really trying to think, what is are they the same? Are they completely other to one another? Are they, this or that? So it's still something of question mark, but maybe saying a bit in relation to what Akhil asked may cast some indirect light on where to go with this other question, i.e. what's the plan, guys? Is there an A? Because forget the B, we don't know the A. No, the A, there's a claim. We want Hindu Rashtra. And I think the A is wrong. So then the question, what's the A? If that's not it, then what is it? But I think the question of the state of the nation, which does interest me a lot because I've been round and round that more or less for 30 years now. What's the form? What is its history? What's the vulnerability? How does it function, the age of the global, what gets eroded, and so on and so on. And there are all these well-known debates about that. But for this argument, Akhil, what I'm thinking is that to explore the ground for the affect that allows citizens to be produced and for them to comply for some time, let's say, for it not to be an insane idea, in other words, for it to have some bite. What is the equivalent of all the things that we knew on the nation side?
Right.
Sacrifice, blood, commonality, language. We know the list, and some things come first for some others, but we know the package. Here, I think, the only thought I have, and it is a very difficult, it means a lot of hard thinking about things we not only don't have enough information about, but we don't know how to think about these things. That's where I don't mind you. I certainly don't. But I take something from Balibar, from whom very long ago I took the idea that it's not, let's say, nations that produce violence, we know that, but violence equally produces nations. So in other words, recruiting armies is one of the ways you install the affect of the nation. It's not, by actually literally getting people to line up, and as it were, to kill and die for the nation. That is when the nation becomes the object of desire, not preconditionally, so to speak. So changing the causal circuit. So what would that be on the state side? Well, on the state side, I think that these insane documentation projects, if you just take the Northeast to say, I'll count where are the Bangladeshis, where are the migrants, who's that, does he look like this, insane. In doing that, you produce a level of conflict, violence, doubt, and uncertainty. That is the affected ground of the citizen. So you simultaneously produce that, and then you say you will secure it once we know who the citizens are. So the two are happened together. So I think the procedures are no longer what we might call, and this may be another reason it's not, the 19th century, is they're not cool. They are bloody. These acts of counting are surrounded by suffering, frustration, fear, people crying literally, auto drivers just crying, where am I going to get these documents? So there's suffering, there is rage. So these are bloody documentation processes. And I think, like in the Balibar example of the nation, that's the crucible. But how it works, for whom, this is it's just an assay in the direction of what you're asking, but I'm sure that field is richly more complicated. But something like that the means for doing something produce the way affects are the ground of possibility of the procedure. Something like that. There's some relation. Maybe.
We have two questions here, and by Janti.
So I just wanted to go back to one of the things you sort of very slightly mentioned at the start, and that had to do with Mrs. Gandhi.
Oh yeah.
And I thought you might come back to that. So one of the things that strikes me, and I'm an economist who's a theorist, so I'm not at all well informed about what's happening in India, and I live in England, so I'm not well informed. But one of the things that strikes me is that it's after a very long time that we have a leader who's had this sort of level of support, broad support. I think the last time this happened really was probably Mrs. Gandhi in the 70s. And there was at the time, she actually imposed emergency. And the thought was that this was obviously, there were many discussions about it, but somehow even someone with the power of Mrs. Gandhi, which was enormous, and she couldn't really do what she wanted the state to do. And so she had to, and I'm sort of wondering whether the popularity and the power that is given, that has been given to Modi has led, whether somehow, something I don't really understand, the logic of the state not really able to do things in an Indian context, which might be rational, which might come across, as you were saying, it's so bloody. It's not, I think most people would think many of these things are, at some abstract level, natural things for a modern state to be doing, but they don't make any sense in an Indian context. Maybe someone who has the sort of power that Modi has forgets that the state has always been very nebulous in India. It's never been. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the long durée, whether it's Mrs. Gandhi, but also way back if you go to Aurangzeb, into Indian history, the nature of the state in India compared to the nature of the state in China.
Our colleague at the University of Chicago, David's Ron Inden, I don't know where Ron is these days, but he wrote early a paper when he was a very young professor, a very advanced PhD student, called The Sick Man of Anglo-Indian Historiography. It was the state. So, and of course, he was a very cantankerous thinker, so he simultaneously knew that was right, but also wanted to say that thinking that way too much was wrong. There was actually not that sick, etc. Anyway, that's wrong. But the argument was about this, or aspect of this in the long run. But in recent times, I'll cut to the front of it and say, the debate between a relatively low affect, delivery-based model and this, which is a completely affect-fueled model of what a state can do, should do, is able to do, needs to do because of its election, and so on, is going to be Delhi elections. It's stark as anything. Kejriwal and his counterparts in the BJP. Kejriwal is almost a kind of parody of Max Weber, law. But people in Delhi rightly say, here's the electricity, here's this, here's that, we like him. So I hear. Now the test will come whether calling him a terrorist, a piece of completely unbelievable stuff, has some impact or not. But you have the two are going to be tested right now, right in the capital. But I think more generally, I'm coming to think that the whole thing about demonetization, GST, this, that, given also this is a completely crony capitalist regime anyway. So if you're Adani and Ambani, there's that, no problem. So the rest of the kind of Vikas business, development and all that, I do think is one bumbling. But the other, the only thing I've heard about demonetization, for example, when it was going on, is it speaks to an idea that the economy is about sacrifice for the nation. So if you suffer, it's good. You lose a job, wonderful. The whole business collapse, great. So it's a completely bizarre idea of what economy and goals for the economy are. It's increase the suffering, and we'll all go marching into some chasm together in the name of something. So I'm just trying to put some words to the strangeness. And I think someone like Indira Gandhi, that way, going back to Nehru, she may have been had a much stronger authoritarian streak and so on. Didn't have these loony ideas. I mean, she did have some actual ideas about the economy. She had an actual planning commission, actual economists, doing actual economic things. Now all that seems more or less a kind of kabuki, we'll do this to the prices, we'll do that there. And then when people suffer, it's like, yeah, of course. That's, that the bad logic of the nation comes back. Suffering, sacrifice, you're dying, great, That's the best thing you can do. No longer, in the army, no longer in Kargil, just any day, lose your business, that's it. It's an exaggeration, but I think something like
Vajanti?
Well, I just wanted to go back to this question about the affect in the nation and state question. It seems that one term that didn't come up in the talk was the notion of truth. And the ways in which this kind of modernity, rationality, etc., bureaucracy actually didn't have to invoke the notion of truth as much as it seems to be invoked today through the negatively. through the idea of fakes, the proliferation of fakes. Right, so even if you get an Aadhaar card and you prove yourself and you become a citizen, etc., it can always be a fake. There's also that side of the story. I mean, so in other words, this notion, the affect of fear is so overwhelming because you can, in a way, not just give yourself freely, but that free giving can also become, an act of sort of questioned as fake.
But also it has no terminus, you see.
Yeah, it's endless.
So what about your father's school certificate, and so on and so forth. So you're absolutely right. I did have another little piece in the wire speaking to this on what happened after Ayodhya decision.
Yeah.
And there I use the phrase that we have, and again have a small invention in India, which we can call falsehood and reconciliation.
Yeah.
It's not truth and reconciliation. We all agree on a series of lies.
Yes.
And therefore, whether we're liberal, left or right, we say, well, don't make it was like this reason, that reason. Whole series of lies, and then everybody's reconciled. That did happen after Ayodhya. That's the most shocking thing. So I say again, India is the land of innovation, falsehood and reconciliation, much better than truth. So that is, to me, the kind of logic that you see there is the kind of Indian formation in which more apparently general things like fake news are absorbed, because you actually found ways of producing a huge consensus around narratives which have this quality of being socially shared lies on a big scale. So it's no longer about rumors, a Muslim guy did something in a Hindu temple. No, it's the big one. It's Ayodhya is going to produce peace. It's actually fair, but it's a whole other terrain. And then, in fact, it produces greater consensus than many other things have in recent times. So I think there is a lot about the truth regime that could be said in India, which part of which is common to our in general,
right?
But part of which always has a India, brand. The branding always goes on.
There are a few questions on this side. Anuradha?
Yeah, I think there's also some students who have some questions. So
yes, see over there, I think near the door.
I can also say what I can say very quickly, and then
yes, and then the others can come in. I'll just.
Yeah. I mean, maybe also just picking up on. I also have had a lot of questions about the affective dimension of this constellation that you drew between these many events that I think we're all trying to put together. But you touched for a moment on this decision by the Supreme Court on the Babri Masjid.
Yes.
And I thought one of my takeaways of this is that it's done two things. It's put together this very positivist, technocratic, statist approach with a highly affective, also aesthetic regime of thought. Yes. And I was hoping you could speak a little more to that in constellation with some of the other things you talked about.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just wait for...
I may not have seen someone's hand up.
Standing by the door.
Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. So my question is kind of about where you ended, which is on some of the causes that you have for hope.
Yeah.
Where you were essentially saying kind of 500 million people can't be thrown out, right? They can't necessarily be ejected. No state can really do that, no matter how much it pretends it can. And it actually kind of reminded me of that old subaltern studies idea, which is that an elite's policies can't do much on the ground due to sheer numbers. There's always been a separate sphere of politics. There is some stasis that will preserve democracy. You can't do that much. And I have been hearing this a lot in non-academic spaces as well, a sort of reliance on India's sheer size and diversity and regional loyalties to say, well, wo kya kar sakte hain? Like how can they manage this? There's simply too much going on. There's too many people, and they won't succeed. And I was just asking, especially given what technologies of surveillance have enabled in countries of similar size, such as China, although obviously very different history, much longer, very different idea of a state, very different forms of institutions. Whether we are a little bit too stuck on this idea that it's just too big.
It's impossible kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, because see what has been achieved elsewhere. And this actually kind of is also something that arises in the question of climate change, right? The millions, hundreds of millions of people that were displaced, right? No border or no nation state can contain 100 million climate refugees, for instance. But that is going to happen at some point. It seems increasingly likely. And so how do we deal with this question of numbers and whether they really are possible, given how much has changed?
Take some water.
Just a talk for pessimism.
That's good, thank you. Sorry, I missed the very last bit you said was?
I'm being pessimistic.
I think all right, what's one more?
There's one more at this end. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if, in addition to putting these themes in a longer frame, if it might be worth putting them in a wider frame as well. Some of the issues you bring up are not are beyond the BJP. I'm thinking about the question of impunity. In places like Punjab, but elsewhere, the police have been seen as, thoroughly compromised by political parties for a long time. No one thinks of the police as someone you can go to for justice.
Correct.
The Aadhaar card was started by Congress. It's a Congress idea.
Right.
Liberalization was a Congress sort of platform. Abrogating 370 might be the last sort of step, but what the Congress has done in Kashmir for 60 years is beyond what the BJP might be doing now. So, given the urgency of the moment, what is at stake in locating, we're seeing this only as a BJP phenomenon, and the danger of the BJP, rightly so. But what needs to be done to not let it become a kind of Modi-Shah phenomenon, and what might happen if we extend our analysis wider to include the Congress in these things?
Wider in that way. I was thinking you were thinking of other places than India, comparative things, but you're thinking in India that this is not only people, that widen in that sense, but it also means going back in time. Indira Gandhi, Nehru, this, that. I get it. Maybe I start there and just quickly, if I may respond to parts at least of these issues, which are all somewhat connected. Yours is a bit different. So I'll simply say, I'm not unsympathetic to what you're saying. So I don't want to paint myself or us into a corner where if we could crack this, get into the heart of the 56-inch chest and examine it, its beating heart, we'll find out. I think that is a seduction to avoid. So my interest is this regime at this moment in this society. And of course, all the precursory histories are important. The longer ones, the medium ones, the colonial one, the Nehruvian one, the Indira Gandhi one. And then you might say on a wider platform, even today, if you take Lok Sabha, it's not like only the BJP thinks these things. A lot of people think this. So I'm not unsympathetic. But I still think one has to be careful not to go too far the other way and to allow, the BJP, Amit Shah, to just bleed into the environment. On the one hand, the environment politically, on the other hand, precedents historically. And especially the second one has been something I've always worried about for a long time, and I worried about it in a very different context that Akil may recall, about globalization, where everybody was saying, what is new here? This is capitalism, this is modernization, this is empire. My feeling is, well then maybe globalization, actually already we knew about it, 40,000 years ago, people were moving, migrants. There's a point at which, historicizing has to be done with some caution. Because the question is, for what? Do you want to know we want to actually see all the precursor elements, or do you want to catch the rupture? Is there a rupture and do you want to catch the rupture? So I'm on that side. But I think doing that innocent of what all was there in place is also a problem. So I'm with you there, but I think this is the case where there are so many last straws on this camel, and we have to find out what is it about this camel that's attracting all the last straws. The last straw, 370, the last straw, Babri Masjid, the last straw, and after a while I'm thinking, so they just touch the thing and they're all tottering. That also doesn't satisfy me. So we have a collective dilemma, I think, what to do about the what's new, what's distinct, and I agree that we shouldn't fetishize either people or even a party, or even the BJP RSS, because I don't follow what that RSS thinks, as I said. The RSS is not the people who are on the front lines, doing the most brutal harm everywhere. It's either the police or it's these other very militant, as people say, goons, gangs, whatever. They are not the RSS, whatever. So there's something complicated there too. So yes, there is a complicated one. I'm with you. But you see where I'm also cautious to not dissolve these particularities into it's all over the place, plus it's always been there. That is also a problem for me. On the related questions before, I think they belong to the same terrain, which is the affect terrain. I still think it's very challenging. I certainly don't feel I have the answers. And it's also a space which is loaded with, in the media and elsewhere, with cliches, about the key affective spaces: hate, anger, rage, this, that. It's hard to break through those. The stories and the cliched accounts of the role of sentiment in politics. So all I can say there is one has to keep working at it, either by context or by field or by space. And I think you mentioned Babri Masjid. I agree with you that it both has a kind of technical dimension and plays to a huge, long build-up of affect. And the only thing I can further say is that there's something where in a decision like that, the two get yoked in a way that is distinctive to this moment, this place, and that requires certainly further thought. On the question from the young lady who was standing but is now sitting, I think I agree with you that the business of large numbers. I once wrote a book called Fear of Small Numbers, but now I'm in the large number problem. You're right, that is a problem. But the way in which it used to exist in Indian historiography was mainly, why is this large number not resisting anything? This was the old problem. Indians are just waiting to be abused, That was a Barrington Moore problem. Why no revolution? Good question. But it's also a question for China, and he gave answers. So that's why that book is very interesting. Why in China this happens, why in India it doesn't happen. And the numbers are always a part of it. I am thinking more of the numbers than the diversity. So I'm not into it's too diverse business. I'm just thinking the logistics of incarceration, surveillance, and so on are very fierce. So the people engaged in that enterprise either have to know some things about technique, technology, kind of Jim Scott like, seeing like a state, how do you do it? Or they have to be, somehow wrong-headed in their idea of what they can actually accomplish. We only, time will tell. But I do think that the business, the scale of the operation does make it a different problem than a much smaller state. And we have in Europe, where I'm living now, I'm surrounded by small states where things happen very fast. Then there's the China factor. Very big, and Wuhan, in 10 days there's a hospital there. In India, they would be still wondering how to give some corrupt payment to some guy who would start the first break, then it would not be finished. It's a joke, but the truth is that kind of command economy in India is a long way away. Whether it's in defecation, bridges, roads, doesn't matter. Just doesn't happen. Unless it's a chemical factory by the Ambanis in the middle of nowhere where you've been given full free rein. But in the middle of public life, you can't just do what you like. The why of that is a big deal. That is, since I think India and China more and more now are converging, though from very different histories. Both, first of all, have become masters of producing massive wealth at the top and a considerable amount of non-wealth below, dispossession. That is the biggest challenge. So they're great at cranking the wealth machine, but the redistribution machine is weak in both cases. And that's becoming clearer and clearer. In China, people thought, no, everybody's doing well. No, they're not doing well. So that's there. And then, of course, there is a much deeper question. I'm not a China expert, but it's evident that there's been a way of massifying participation in China. Great leap forward does that, which India has never seen. So the question shifts, why is that and so on. I don't know. Akil, yes.
Arjun, I'm really puzzled by this, the point you've been quite rightly making about how crony capitalism just introduces a kind of, reflects a kind of attitude of don't care, I mean, we're just going to do this, and but what is 80% of the corporate sector doing? I mean, what is this, as in Premji and Tatas and Narayan Murthy's, what the hell are they saying? We can't put all our eggs in a basket, which is in any case favoring the Gujarati mafia. The Congress party has always been a bourgeois party. We should keep it alive. I mean, why aren't these thoughts occurring? I just don't get what's going on.
In the case of supreme elite false consciousness, why don't these people get what their interests are? You're right. I think the answer is terrifying.
You and I were brought up to think that if 80% of the corporate sector in a capitalist economy wants something, it tends to happen.
Get done.
But this, it's just there's something totally unanalyzed here, and you can't just say it's fear and so on.
No. There is some of that, I think, but there is differences, say, between Mahendra, who's spoken up. Is it scale? You see, I'm wondering why these differences and why people ought to be really, by and large. I mean, Ratan Tata could more or less say what he likes. I mean, things would have he could speak for his interest, properly speaking, but he doesn't. So, I mean, a cognate of that, I mean, this is now going to the conversational mode, is the film industry. There's some question, would Shah Rukh or Salman, I mean, Shah Rukh is finally spoken up. I mean, bleated a little bit very late. Salman, this one, that one, Amir. What? They actually think they'll be taken away into Guantanamo? I don't think so. If they go, everybody goes. But again, why don't they see that none of this is that terrific for the bloody entertainment industry, which is nothing small? So I share your questions. I mean, are people foolish, scared, worried about the stability behind their profits, thinking that something will stabilize? I don't know. Because they don't tell you. They don't say we're doing this or not doing this for this reason. It's hard to know. Puzzling.
I think David, and I actually had a little question, but I'm willing to leave it.
You go first.
Go ahead.
Well, you have raised so many issues. I want to go back to the beginning, though, which I think something has to be said. There has been a very considerable and impressive resistance to all of this, and you can see. I can sit at home with my iPad and look at NDTV and see the police or the Gundas beating the students at JNU, or the library at the Jamia being trashed, or all these things are happening before the eyes of the world, not just in India. And somehow I'm connecting that with what you also said in the early part, which was the total randomness and inefficiency, which you're coming back to here in all of this. So that something that's going on is on the level of performance and your theater state. Something of that is happening. Certainly it's bloody and so on, but it's not and mobilized on either side, consistent pattern. And then, going back to your earlier work, it's not just the state or within the boundaries of India, it is the wider world. So Modi comes with Trump to a stadium in Texas, and large numbers appear for that. That's all part of the same story. And we have all this NRI participation, which seems to go against the citizenship or the statesmanship, maybe, or is it at least inconsistent with it in some way or other? So all of that is and then the affect part, instead of affect versus coercive power. The coercive, you think of the Weberian concept of the state as the monopoly of coercive power, and and Ranaji Gua saying that's all the British ever had was dominance
without hegemony.
Without hegemony. I don't know how much dominance or hegemony there is in all of this system, because then that goes back to your other point in the early part of the paper about how India is full of the cellular parts, which survive and participate, either resisting or not. That's the system of Indian society. So that a mobilized, monolithic power thing, call it the state or call it something else, isn't there.
And actually, this is what I was going to ask about, is something very similar. Because in some of your earlier pieces, which actually sounded a much more optimistic note than you did in today's talk, I remember there's something which is very powerful, which you said about, India is a land of many minorities.
Yes.
You said million minorities. India is a land of million minorities. And the very concept of the majority is actually, under great stress in light of the fact that India is a place of a million minorities. And, this tension that you're describing between the state and something which is much more fluid, which might, and I think everyone is gesturing towards that when we're talking about affect.
Yeah.
And this kind of notion of the affective feeling of the nation. I was thinking of, how your references to enumeration as this kind of establishment of an identity flies in the face of how people might self-identify. And I was thinking of for instance, the 1871 census of the British, when they would go out to their villages and people would identify themselves as, I am Mohammedan Hindu. And the very fact that could not be properly categorized makes this question of enumeration even more difficult. So what I actually want, and this connects with what David is asking about the sources of resistance, that going back to this point about the million minorities, is that ultimately going to be this what saves India from the coercive power of the state? It's a kind of self-perception.
Maybe what I can say, just as a reflection on these many questions which are indeed connected and which touch on different things. I said, first of all, is because these things are unfolding in front of our eyes, I think my own analysis, is a little bit like touching this thing, then touching that thing. So it's got the contradictions between what particular part of this picture tells me one day, and then I see something else that shows me something else. So I think there are these problems both out there and certainly in how I understand things. But I do think it's worth saying that the protest that I saw in Mumbai, but I read about and see visualized in Delhi and Kerala and in thousands of places, are truly remarkable. There is no doubt that there is a kind of broad-based, women-led, student-led and youth-led uprising, but which is not organized. It's clearly fairly spontaneous. It's fairly internally diverse. It's not owned by parties. It's very easy to say, it's fairly tempting, shall we say, to see this as remarkable. And I do think it is, and I say this somewhere in something I've written, I would say today, it comes closest to resembling the most mass moment of the Congress before the British were pushed out. Nandi, and that moment, where there were hundreds of things going on, where something congealed somewhere with sufficient effect to produce Indian independence, even if there are 1,000 reasons for Indian independence. But that phenomenon, mass civil disobedience, peaceful, and cross caste and interest group, these are all thoroughly remarkable. I tell you, the reason I don't allow myself to think it's decisive, and it is the evidence of the affective reality of that 500 million, even if it's only 500,000 of them, even if you count every Shaheen Bagh, it's a small number, but that's the place you see the affect corresponding to that large number which can never be simply pushed away. My concern, as with almost every other movement of this type that we've seen worldwide in the last 20 years, is stamina, who has more, who can withstand the steady, literal pushing by the police, by this one, by that one, by the economy, by jobs, by sustaining these things. That's my worry, sustainability, and of course, secondarily, leadership and so on. So the usual worries that one has based on Arab Spring, based on Turkey, based here, where you see things and then, something changes. So that's the reason for my not saying more and more and saying more decisively that this set of movements is going to win. I would love to say it, but something holds me back. Anyway, I should stop.
Well, thank you so much, Arjun. This has really been wonderful.
Thank you all. Thank you.